In the heart of the untamed wilderness, a scarred and fearful wolf prowled the shadows, knowing only survival and solitude. Hunted by men, abandoned by his pack, he trusted no one, until a compassionate woman risked everything to change his fate. Against all odds, she bridged the divide between fear and trust, proving that even the wildest hearts could learn love. But as nature and man conspired against them, could their fragile bond withstand the ultimate test? The storm raged outside, turning the forest into a howling, frozen wasteland. Snowflakes battered the windows, swirling like restless spirits in the wind. Inside the small wooden cabin, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Elena sat in a worn rocking chair, cradling her 1-year-old son, Noah, in her arms. His tiny fingers curled around the edge of his blanket, his chubby cheeks flushed with warmth. He let out a soft, sleepy sigh, completely unaware of the chaos outside. But Elena was not so lucky. She had lived in these woods long enough to recognize the danger that came with storms like this. Hunger drove wild animals from their dens, forcing them to venture closer to human settlements in search of food. Her grip on Noah tightened as a distant sound carried through the wind, a howl. Not just one, but a chorus of them. Wolves. Elena's heart pounded. She stood carefully, walking to the window without making a sound. The storm blurred everything beyond the glass, but she could see shadows moving among the trees. The wolves were out there, circling, waiting. A sudden thump against the porch made her gasp. Something, or someone, was right outside her door. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She clutched Noah closer, his warm body pressing against hers as she took a cautious step toward the door. The wind howled like a ghost, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin. Thump, scratch. The sound came again, more urgent this time. Something was desperate. Elena's first instinct was to grab the rifle that rested on the mantel above the fireplace. Out here in the wilderness, she had learned never to take chances. But as her fingers brushed the cold metal, she hesitated. The scratching at the door wasn't the wild, frenzied attack of a predator. It was persistent, but restrained, almost pleading. Noah let out a soft giggle in her arms, his tiny hand reaching toward the door. He had no fear, only curiosity. Elena took a deep breath and slowly approached the frosted window beside the door. She wiped away the condensation with trembling fingers, and what she saw made her heart ache. A mother wolf stood on the snow-covered porch, her thick fur soaked with ice and her ribs visible beneath her coat. Her golden eyes locked onto Elena's, and in them, she saw something she never expected. A silent plea. Huddled beneath her were 2 tiny cubs, their frail bodies shivering violently. They pressed against their mother for warmth, their tiny paws barely visible beneath the deep snow. Elena's breath came out in a shudder. She had heard stories of wolves attacking livestock, even cabins when starvation drove them mad. But this mother wolf wasn't baring her teeth or growling. She wasn't trying to break in. She was begging. A lump formed in Elena's throat. She looked at Noah, who was still reaching toward the door, his bright eyes filled with wonder. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know what to do. Elena's heart pounded as she stood frozen at the window. Outside, the mother wolf never looked away. Her golden eyes filled with something beyond hunger, a plea, a desperate, wordless request for mercy. The wind howled louder, sending a fresh wave of snow cascading off the cabin's roof. The cubs whimpered, burrowing deeper into their mother's fur. Elena felt an overwhelming conflict rage within her. She was a mother too. She knew what it was like to protect a child at all costs. But these were wolves, wild creatures that had no place inside a human's home. A memory surfaced. She was 10 years old, standing at the edge of the forest with her father, a hunter. They had found a wolf caught in a rusted trap, its leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Elena had begged him to save it, tears streaming down her face, but he had only looked at her with sad eyes and said, Never trust a starving wolf, Elena. Desperation makes them unpredictable. The rifle had fired a second later. She shook the memory away, her fingers tightening around Noah's blanket. Her father had believed in survival, in protecting what was his. But what if, just this once, she didn't close the door? A soft giggle broke through her thoughts. Noah, still cradled in her arms, reached out toward the door again, his tiny fingers stretching as if trying to touch the creatures on the other side. His innocent eyes held no fear, only understanding. Scratch. Thump. The mother wolf lowered herself, pressing her body closer to the door, her head dipping in a submissive bow. She was making herself small, non-threatening. Elena's chest tightened. This wolf wasn't attacking. She wasn't demanding. She was pleading. And against all logic, Elena found herself reaching for the latch. Elena's fingers trembled as they brushed the cold metal latch. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to think, to remember the warnings her father had given her. But then she looked down at Noah, his tiny hand still outstretched, his face filled with pure, unshaken trust. He didn't see a predator. He saw a mother in need. Snowflakes whirled in, catching in Noah's soft brown hair. He let out a delighted squeal. The mother wolf flinched but did not move. She watched, waiting, as if she knew this moment was fragile, balanced between trust and fear. Elena knelt down, still shielding Noah against her chest, and extended her free hand just slightly. The mother wolf hesitated. Then, ever so slowly, she took a small step forward, her massive paws sinking into the threshold. She lowered her head, sniffing at the warmth spilling from inside. Her ribs protruded against her thin fur. The cubs, sensing their mother's movement, peeked up at Elena with wide, frightened eyes. Elena felt something break inside her. They were just babies, like Noah. Carefully, she reached for the thick blanket draped over the chair. With slow, deliberate movements, she unfolded it and placed it on the wooden floor just inside the door. Then, with her heart hammering in her chest, she whispered, "Come in." The mother wolf exhaled softly, almost like a sigh of relief. She stepped forward cautiously, her cubs scrambling after her. The warmth of the cabin engulfed them, and they collapsed onto the blanket in exhaustion. Elena shut the door, locking out the howling storm. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Noah giggled, and to Elena's astonishment, one of the cubs, small, weak, and shivering, crawled toward him. Instead of flinching, instead of fear, Noah simply reached out his chubby little fingers. And the cub, a creature of the wild, a creature that should have been afraid, pressed its tiny nose against his hand. A bridge was formed, a moment that defied nature. And in that moment, Elena knew she had made the right choice. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the cabin with its golden warmth. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was only silence, except for the quiet breathing of the wolves and the soft giggles of Noah. Elena knelt by the mother wolf, watching her carefully. Even though the animal had stepped inside, even though she had shown no aggression, Elena knew she was still wild. Still unpredictable. But as she looked closer, she saw something that melted her last remaining hesitation. The mother wolf was exhausted. Her breathing was slow, almost labored. Snowflakes clung to her fur, her ribs pressed tightly against her thin frame. She hadn't come here as a predator. She had come as a mother, desperate to save her cubs. The cubs, tiny and weak, had nestled into the blanket Elena had laid down, their small bodies shivering despite the warmth. Noah, still sitting beside them, reached out again, this time toward the second cub. Elena held her breath. The cub hesitated, but then, as if sensing no danger, it licked Noah's fingers. Noah squealed in delight, his eyes bright with wonder. He clapped his hands, making the mother wolf lift her head ever so slightly, her ears twitching. But she did not growl. She did not move. She was watching, waiting. Elena slowly reached behind her, grabbing an old half-empty bowl of stew she had left on the table earlier. It wasn't much, just bits of leftover venison and broth, but it was food. She hesitated. Was this a mistake? Was she encouraging something she couldn't control? Then she looked at the cubs. They were too weak to even stand. Her decision was made. Carefully, she slid the bowl toward the mother wolf. The wolf stiffened, her golden eyes flicking from the bowl to Elena. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, cautiously, she lowered her muzzle and sniffed at the bowl. The scent of food must have overwhelmed her because she let out a soft, barely audible whimper before lapping up the broth. Elena let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The cubs stirred, their noses twitching at the smell. One of them weakly dragged itself forward, dipping its tiny snout into the bowl beside its mother. The second cub followed. They ate. Noah clapped again, delighted, and the mother wolf, in a movement so gentle it stunned Elena, lowered her head and licked his cheek. Elena gasped, but Noah only laughed, his tiny hands reaching for the mother wolf's fur, his innocence seeing no danger, only warmth, only trust. And in that moment, Elena realized something. She had not just let wolves into her cabin. She had let them into her heart, and there was no turning back now. The wind outside howled like a restless spirit, rattling the wooden shutters, but inside the cabin, a strange kind of peace settled. The mother wolf lay still on the floor, her golden eyes half lidded with exhaustion. Her cubs, after lapping up the last drops of broth, curled into tight little balls beside her, their tiny bodies finally relaxing in the warmth. Elena remained kneeling a few feet away, watching them carefully. The firelight flickered across her face, her mind still grappling with the enormity of what she had just done. She had let wolves into her home. Not just any wolves, starving ones. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Never trust a starving wolf, Elena. Desperation makes them unpredictable. But was that really true? She glanced at Noah, who was now sitting cross-legged beside the cubs, his small fingers stroking one soft fur. The cub made no attempt to pull away. If anything, it nuzzled closer. Elena felt something stir in her chest. This wasn't a dangerous animal. This was a baby just like her own. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. This was madness, completely insane. But it was also too late to turn back. Her gaze drifted to the mother wolf. The animal was watching her in return, but not with hostility. There was no growl, no show of teeth, just quiet observation. Elena hesitated before making her next move. She stood slowly, moving toward the kitchen. The mother wolf tensed, her ears flicking up, but she did not rise. Elena pulled open the small wooden cabinet above the counter. She had one more loaf of bread, a half-wheel of cheese, and a few strips of dried venison. Not much, but after watching the wolves eat, she knew they needed more. She broke off a piece of the venison and knelt back down, holding it out. The mother wolf stared at her hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, she lifted her head and stretched her neck forward. She sniffed the food first, her warm breath ghosting over Elena's fingertips. Then, with the most delicate movement, she took the strip of venison from Elena's palm. Elena let out a slow breath. The wolf chewed, swallowed, then did something that made Elena's heart stop. She turned her head and nudged a small piece of the meat toward her cubs. She was feeding them first. Elena's throat tightened. This mother wasn't a monster. She wasn't a ruthless predator. She was just trying to keep her babies alive. Elena glanced at Noah, who had since leaned against the cubs, his tiny body curled into their warmth. His breath was slow, steady, already drifting to sleep. She smiled softly. Then, without another word, She reached for a second piece of meat and offered it again, and this time, the mother wolf took it without hesitation. Elena sat on the edge of her rocking chair, unable to take her eyes off the scene. It was surreal, unbelievable. Here she was, alone in the middle of the wilderness, sharing her home with wolves. If her father were alive to see this, he would have thought she had lost her mind. "Wolves don't change," he would say. "They'll take what they need, and when you let your guard down, they'll turn on you." And yet, Elena glanced at the mother wolf who was still watching her. Not like a hunter sizing up its prey, not like a beast waiting for the right moment to attack, but like something different, something closer to understanding. Elena sighed. "I don't know why I did this," she murmured almost to herself. "I should be afraid of you." The mother wolf's ears flicked at the sound of her voice. She didn't move, didn't growl. She only blinked, her golden eyes glowing softly in the firelight. Elena studied the deep ridges of her ribs, the thinness of her fur. She had been starving. The snowstorm had left her with nowhere to turn, no food to hunt. And yet, she had come here, not attacking, not demanding, but pleading. Had she known Elena would help? The question lingered in Elena's mind as she reached for the worn quilt draped over the back of the chair. A simple gesture. She rose to her feet, took a few careful steps forward, and lowered the blanket onto the floor, just beside the wolves. The mother wolf tensed, her ears twitching, but she didn't move away. Elena sat back down, watching as the animal sniffed at the fabric, hesitated, then, slowly, lowered her head onto it. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding slipped from Elena's lips. A silent trust had been formed. She glanced toward the window. The storm still raged outside, howling against the cabin walls, but for the first time that night she didn't feel alone. She looked back at the wolves, at Noah sleeping peacefully beside them, at the mother wolf curled up near the fire, her cubs tucked safely beneath her. And for the first time she realized something. This wasn't just an act of survival. This was something more. This was family. The night passed in a blur of flickering firelight and soft, steady breathing. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin there was warmth, there was life, and, somehow, there was peace. Elena barely slept. She dozed lightly in her rocking chair, her mind caught between exhaustion and disbelief. Every now and then she woke to check on Noah, only to find him curled up peacefully between the two cubs, their tiny bodies pressed against him for warmth. And the mother wolf. She never moved far. She lay awake for most of the night, her golden eyes half open, watching over her cubs, and watching over Elena and Noah too. It was an unspoken agreement. Neither of them truly trusted the other. But they had found something stronger than fear. They had found understanding. By the time morning arrived, the storm had begun to die down. The wind no longer howled, and faint light pushed through the frost-covered window. Elena stirred, blinking against the dim glow of dawn, and that's when she felt it, a weight against her feet. She looked down. The mother wolf was curled just beside her chair, her head resting on her paws. She had moved closer during the night, closer to Elena. Something inside her chest squeezed. She had feared this animal, had nearly turned her away, had been raised to believe that wolves and humans could never share the same space without bloodshed. And yet, here she was, a living contradiction. Elena carefully shifted in her seat, her movements slow and deliberate. The mother wolf's ears twitched, but she didn't lift her head. She wasn't afraid anymore. Elena exhaled, running a hand over her face. Her gaze shifted to the door, where small streaks of sunlight filtered through the cracks. The storm was ending, and that meant, sooner or later, the wolves would have to leave. A lump formed in her throat. She should be relieved. This was supposed to be temporary. She had done her part. And yet, her eyes drifted to Noah, who was now awake, his small hands running through the soft fur of one of the cubs. He giggled when the pup wriggled under his touch, its tiny tail flicking in delight. He had no fear, only trust, only love. Elena swallowed hard. She wasn't ready. Not yet. She looked at the mother wolf again, and in that moment she knew the wolf was thinking the same thing, because when their eyes met, the wolf did not turn away. She just stared, waiting. The morning light stretched across the cabin floor, golden and soft, cutting through the remnants of the storm. Snow had piled high against the window, but the worst had passed. The world outside was silent, frozen in the wake of the blizzard. Inside, the warmth of the fire still flickered, casting shadows along the wooden walls. Elena stood by the window, staring out at the vast, snow-covered wilderness. The trees were heavy with ice, their branches bent under the weight. The trail leading away from the cabin was buried in white. The world had changed overnight, and so had she. Behind her, Noah giggled as the wolf cubs tumbled over each other, their tiny paws slipping against the wooden floor. They had already grown bolder, their playfulness returning now that their bellies were full and their bodies warm. Elena turned her gaze to the mother wolf. She still lay near the fire, stretched out on the quilt Elena had given her. But she was watching, always watching. Not with fear, not with aggression, with calm, with trust. Elena took a slow breath. This was the moment she had been dreading. The storm was over. The wolves had survived, which meant they would have to go. She swallowed hard. It was the right thing to do, wasn't it? Wolves weren't meant to live with people. They belonged to the wild. And yet, when she looked at the mother wolf, she felt something pull at her chest. Was she really ready to let them go? Noah, as if sensing her hesitation, suddenly looked up. His bright, innocent eyes locked onto her, and with a small, eager voice, he said, "Mama, can we keep them?" Elena's heart clenched. She looked at him, then at the cubs curled around his small legs, then finally at the mother wolf. And the mother wolf, as if she understood exactly what was being asked, lifted her head and met Elena's gaze. Neither of them moved, neither of them looked away. A silent question, a silent answer. Elena took a deep breath. She had a choice to make. The weight of Noah's question hung in the air. Can we keep them? Elena's chest tightened. She glanced down at her son, who sat cross-legged on the floor, his tiny hands buried in the cub's fur. They wriggled under his touch, their small tails flicking with excitement. They weren't afraid of him. They weren't afraid of this home. And the mother wolf. She wasn't afraid either. She was watching Elena again, waiting. It was almost as if she was asking the same question. The fire crackled softly. Elena sighed, rubbing her hands over her face. This was madness. She couldn't keep wolves. Could she? She turned back toward the window, staring out at the frozen wilderness. The storm had passed, but the world beyond her cabin was still harsh, unforgiving. Food would be scarce. Prey would be buried beneath the snow, hiding, waiting for spring. Would the mother wolf even survive out there? Would her cubs? A deep, painful part of Elena understood what it meant to be a mother in desperate times. She had lost her husband to the winter 2 years ago. A single, cruel accident. One wrong step on ice, one fatal fall, and suddenly she was alone, left to care for Noah in a world that didn't care whether they survived or not. She had fought, struggled, and endured. And now, so had this wolf. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Elena turned back toward the mother wolf. She took a slow, careful step forward, kneeling just a few feet away. with understanding. And then, ever so carefully, she stepped forward, closing the final distance between them. Elena stayed still. She didn't flinch as the wolf lowered her head and touched her cold nose against Elena's hand. A silent answer, a choice made. She was staying. Elena let out a slow, shaky breath. Behind her, Noah cheered. The cubs yipped in excitement, tumbling over one another, their tails wagging. Elena smiled. She had let the wolves in. She had trusted when every instinct told her not to. And now they were family. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It had become something more. As the morning sun stretched across the frost-covered land outside, warmth filled the small wooden home. Not just from the fire, but from something deeper. Trust. Elena sat near the hearth, watching Noah and the cubs tumble around in playful chaos. Their tiny paws skidded across the wooden floor, their playful growls mixing with Noah's bright giggles. The mother wolf remained near the door, watching. Always watching. Not with fear, not with hesitation, but with understanding. Elena knew she had crossed a threshold, one she could never take back. She had made a choice. And so had the wolf. They were bound now, not as owner and pet, not even as human and beast, but as two mothers, each trying to protect what they loved. Elena rose from her chair and moved toward the wooden table. She pulled a knife from the drawer, slicing through what was left of her bread and cheese. It wasn't much, but she knew the wolves couldn't survive on venison alone. She placed a small plate on the floor. The mother wolf's ears flicked, but she didn't move. Not at first. She simply watched as Elena sat down beside Noah, waiting. Elena exhaled softly. "It's yours," she murmured. The wolf hesitated for only a moment longer. Then, with slow, careful steps, she approached the plate. Elena didn't flinch as the wolf's thick fur brushed against her arm. She stayed still, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. The wolf sniffed at the bread, and then, in a way so gentle it surprised Elena, she took a piece and nudged it toward her cubs first. Elena swallowed against the lump in her throat. She had made the right choice. She wasn't keeping a wolf captive. She wasn't taming a wild animal. She was giving her a choice, and the wolf, for the first time in her life, had chosen trust. The mother wolf and her cubs had settled into the cabin as if they had always belonged there. The fear that had once gripped Elena was fading, replaced by something new, something warmer, acceptance. She watched as Noah gently scratched behind one of the cub's ears, his small fingers disappearing into its thick fur. The little creature melted under his touch, its tiny tail thumping against the wooden floor. The mother wolf remained close, but calm. She no longer flinched when Elena moved around the cabin, no longer stared at her with sharp, wary eyes. The unspoken barrier between them was crumbling. By midday, Elena bundled herself in her thick coat and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the snow deep and untouched except for the faint indentations of wolf tracks leading toward the trees. She knew what it meant. The mother wolf had ventured out before dawn, but had returned. She still had the freedom to leave. And yet, she had come back. Elena stared at the horizon, heart pounding. Was it possible? Could a wild creature truly choose to stay with a human? Not because it had to, but because it wanted to. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but not from the cold. She turned back toward the cabin, pushing open the wooden door. The scent of burning wood and warm fur greeted her as she stepped inside. The mother wolf lifted her head, her golden eyes locking onto Elena's. Not a challenge, not a warning, a greeting. Elena exhaled, a soft smile tugging at her lips. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if this fragile trust would last forever. But for now, for this moment, it was enough. And maybe, just maybe, She and the wolf weren't so different after all. The sun hung low in the winter sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered land. The storm had passed, leaving behind an untouched, glittering expanse of white. Inside the cabin, life had settled into an unspoken rhythm. Elena moved about the small kitchen, slicing what remained of their dried venison. She placed a portion into a wooden bowl and set it gently on the floor. The mother wolf lifted her head, watching. She no longer hesitated. She trusted. With slow, deliberate steps, she rose to her feet and padded toward the bowl. Her cubs, sensing her movement, scampered after her. Elena watched as the wolf nudged a piece of meat toward her young ones before taking her own share. That act, feeding her cubs before herself, tugged at something deep inside Elena's heart. A mother's love. It was something she understood more than anything else in this world. She glanced at Noah, who sat nearby, a bright grin on his face as one of the cubs rolled onto its back, playfully pawing at the air. The warmth in the cabin wasn't just from the fire, it was from them, from the life they had built here, together. Elena sighed, leaning back against the table. This was not what she had planned. She had expected the wolves to leave as soon as the storm ended, but they hadn't. They had stayed, and not out of desperation, but out of choice. Just as Elena had chosen to let them in, just as Noah had chosen to love them without fear, just as the mother wolf had chosen to trust. Elena didn't know how long they would remain, maybe forever, maybe only until spring. But for now, she knew one thing. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, together. The days stretched into a quiet, unspoken understanding between woman and wolf. Elena no longer flinched when the mother wolf moved near her. She no longer second-guessed her choice to let them stay. That choice had already been made, by both of them. The wolves had become part of the cabin's rhythm. Noah and the cubs played by the fire, their bond growing stronger with every passing day. The tiny creatures followed him like shadows, their playful yips filling the once quiet home with warmth. And the mother wolf? She watched. She always watched. Not with fear, not with suspicion, but with something far deeper, a silent promise. She protected Noah as if he were one of her own. Whenever he stepped outside to gather firewood with Elena, the mother wolf followed at a distance, her golden eyes scanning the trees, ears twitching at the slightest sound. Elena noticed. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. One evening, as the sky darkened and the stars emerged, Elena stepped onto the small porch, wrapping her coat tightly around her. The wind had died down, leaving the world eerily still. The mother wolf followed, padding silently beside her. For a long time, neither of them moved. They simply stared out into the wilderness. Two mothers, two protectors, bound by something beyond words. Finally, Elena spoke. "You still have the choice to leave," she murmured, her breath forming soft clouds in the freezing air. "You're free." The mother wolf turned her head, eyes glowing in the moonlight. Then, with a quiet grace, she sat beside Elena, her fur brushing lightly against the woman's leg. Elena swallowed. That was her answer. She wasn't here out of survival anymore. She wasn't trapped. She was choosing to stay. A lump formed in Elena's throat, but she said nothing. Instead, she reached out, hesitating only for a moment before resting her hand lightly on the mother wolf's thick fur. The wolf didn't move away. She stayed. And in that silence, under the stars, a pact was sealed. Elena wasn't just protecting them anymore. They were protecting each other. Winter lingered, but the harshest days had passed. The snow remained thick on the ground, but the winds had softened, no longer howling with the same merciless bite. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had transformed into something else, a sanctuary. Elena sat on the porch, watching as Noah played in the snow with the cubs. They darted around him, their small bodies kicking up white powder, their high-pitched yips blending with his laughter. It was a sight she never could have imagined. A child playing with wolves. A mother sharing her home with a creature she had once feared. A woman who had learned that trust, even in the wildest of hearts, was possible. She turned her gaze to the mother wolf, who lay beside her, her thick fur brushing against Elena's boot. The wolf's golden eyes watched the scene before them, ears twitching slightly. Elena let out a slow breath. "I thought you'd be gone by now," she murmured. The wolf didn't react, didn't turn her head, just kept watching. Elena smiled softly. "I guess we were both wrong about each other, huh?" A gust of wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the distant sounds of the wilderness. The mother wolf lifted her head slightly, listening. Then, after a long moment, she exhaled through her nose and, ever so gently, leaned into Elena's side. Elena stilled, not out of fear, not out of hesitation, but because she understood what it meant. This was no longer a temporary arrangement. The mother wolf had chosen her pack, and it included Elena. Tears stung at Elena's eyes, but she blinked them away. She reached down, running her fingers through the wolf's thick fur, her touch light but certain. They had found something stronger than survival, stronger than instinct, stronger than fear. They had found family, and no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The sun hung low in the winter sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered land. The storm had passed, leaving behind an untouched, glittering expanse of white. Inside the cabin, life had settled into an unspoken rhythm. Elena moved about the small kitchen, slicing what remained of their dried venison. She placed a portion into a wooden bowl and set it gently on the floor. The mother wolf lifted her head, watching. She no longer hesitated. She trusted. With slow, deliberate steps, she rose to her feet and padded toward the bowl. Her cubs, sensing her movement, scampered after her. Elena watched as the wolf nudged a piece of meat toward her young ones before taking her own share. That act, feeding her cubs before herself, tugged at something deep inside Elena's heart. A mother's love. It was something she understood more than anything else in this world. She glanced at Noah, who sat nearby, a bright grin on his face as one of the cubs rolled onto its back, playfully pawing at the air. The warmth in the cabin wasn't just from the fire, it was from them, from the life they had built here, together. Elena sighed, leaning back against the table. This was not what she had planned. She had expected the wolves to leave as soon as the storm ended, but they hadn't. They had stayed, and not out of desperation, but out of choice. Just as Elena had chosen to let them in, just as Noah had chosen to love them without fear, just as the mother wolf had chosen to trust. Elena didn't know how long they would remain, maybe forever, maybe only until spring. But for now, she knew one thing. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, together.